here. Okay. Now, we all know that old Dartmouth is a lot bigger than Dartmouth today. And so this is a map of the Plymouth colony up until 1691, and there is Dartmouth, which includes, as we know, parts of Little Compton and Tiverton, which were in Massachusetts then, and Westport and Dartmouth and New Bedford and Fairhaven and Acushnet. And that's what we'll be talking about that tonight. Did it again. I got to learn how to use this, folks. Excuse me. All right. So at the same time, this is the way that the Indian tribes were distributed. The Wampanoag, you see, goes all the way over to Tiverton and Little Compton, which are Bristol, Rhode Island was still part of Massachusetts. It might not have been part of old Dartmouth, but it was part of Massachusetts. So where King Philip lived was in Massachusetts then too. And we know that there were the Nauset Indians and the Narragansett Indians, and we still have Pequot Indians that live around here and come to BCC. So the first, I'm going to talk about 6 churches that were in existence, or 6 meeting houses, or 6 groups of religious people, because people named themselves differently. They didn't always call themselves a church. And the first one that would have been in existence in 1708 was a Baptist church founded in Tiverton by John Cook. So the first Baptist church of Dartmouth or New Bedford was really in Tiverton, and it's still there. And it is today on 7 Old Stone Church Road, and even though this is not a picture of the original building, it's in, I think, pretty much the same place.
Pam?
Yes?
Could you mention who John Cook was?
Yes, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Okay. The second church is the Indian Friends Meeting House, which is about a mile south of the Vol store on Horseneck Road. It's on the west bank of the Slocum River. It's just north of the Slocum Reserve. Then, of course, we all know the Apponeganset Meeting House, which was first built in 1699. Once again, this is not a picture of the original building. The building was rebuilt in 1790 to be the building that it is today. But it is in the same general location, we believe, pretty much on the same foundation. Then in Fairhaven, what is Fairhaven today, is Nookacumamanset. I'm never quite sure how to say that, and maybe some of you have heard it pronounced and could say it better than I. And it's pretty much believed that it is just as you start down the Sconnecut Neck, it is in what is called Little Bay. So as you're on Sconnecut Neck Road, you really can't see all the way out to the bay, because it's all built up there on Sconnecut Road. And this was reported by Samuel Danforth in 1698 that this group of praying Indians was there, and tells the name of their pastor. The other praying Indians were on what we call now River Road, right about where the Acushnet River goes under the head of the river bridge. And not that the Indians lived on the bridge, but I would say they lived on the west side of the Acushnet River there. And they would more or less maybe migrate there depending on whether the herring were coming up the river. And now that the Acushnet Sawmill Dam has been taken out, the original flow of the herrings goes all the way up into behind Keith's orchard, and with the fish ladder, the ladders that they put back in. So Indians would go there at the time of the year when the herring were spawning to catch fish, and so they had a congregation there. And then at the head of the river was the Precinct Church, and this is a building built in 1744, but built on the same location as the first Precinct Church. So those are the 6. So now what I propose to do is to go back and give a little history of how each of the 6 and how they came to be. First, before we say that, we all know this story, but just to put it in a little context, our whole area was purchased from Usamikun, or Massasoit. And there's his statue in Plymouth. And there is the purchase, and we have that hanging in better, in calligraphy to the town hall. And there were 36 purchasers in all, 34 shares, and a couple of groups each took half a share. So Francis Cook, the father, the pilgrim, and his son, you see that John Cook was a witness, but Francis Cook and Sarah Jenny, who signed as Miss Jennings, the ancestor of the Jennings, Dr. Jenny and the Jenny family in the area, and Henry Howland were included in the 36 purchasers. So right there you have Francis Cook's son, John Cook, became the Baptist. Sarah Jenny was the one who helped, well, she did not get the precinct church started, but it was her land that the precinct church was started on, and eventually the family gave the land to the church, and it's now the Acushnet Cemetery. And Henry Howland, his family became the Friends, and we know so many of them still in Dartmouth still have the Howland name and are our friends. And there is one of the engravings that's at the Library of Congress of what the purchase may have looked like. And the Plymouth records refer to Indian settlements in this area. They call them Coxet, which is Westport, Ponagansett, which is Arraponagansett, and Kushina, which is Acushnet. So the first church. John Cook was a deacon in Plymouth. He was about 14 when he came over on the Mayflower. He was one of the youngest that came on the Mayflower. And when he got to be about about 10 years later, so he was about 24 when Roger Williams, who had already been the pastor teacher at Boston and then the pastor teacher at Salem, came down and got the job as the assistant pastor, or what they called the pastor teacher, at Plymouth. And John Cook, young John Cook, by then he had a family and a wife, and he was starting leadership. They made him a deacon, I think, as a young man. And Roger Williams talked about things like liberty of conscience and individual interpretation of scripture and separation of church and state and religious tolerance of other people who didn't believe the same thing as you did. And he also talked about fair treatment of the Indians. It seems to be the fair treatment of the Indians that got him kicked out of Plymouth, because he wrote an article on how they should be buying the land from the Indians and not just taking it. And that's when he got kicked out, and he went over and began Providence. But John Cook, it wasn't a case. You remember in Boston when Anne Hutchinson left Boston, Mary Dyer left Boston, Russell Cornell's ancestors left Boston, a group left Boston in support of Anne Hutchinson. But when Roger Williams left Plymouth, John Cook stayed in Plymouth. But 2 years later, a different person came along with some of these Baptistic ideas, and his name was Samuel Gorton. And he was a little more outrageous in his ideas. He believed in liberty of conscience and freedom of speech so much that, it's like someone we actually know who says things that maybe he's just saying to get us going. We know a politician like that? Well, this is what he was like for the whole of his life. And he went to Warwick and started the Warwick First Baptist Church in Warwick. And I just have to say that one time when the organist from the Congregational Church of South Dartmouth, Thelma Edwardson, and I were going to Disney World together for a vacation, we got to Boston. We were in that VIP lounge where the tour groups get to go. And there came in all of the people from the First Baptist Church of Warwick, and we all went to Disney World together, and now here I am studying about the First Church of Warwick. So when something must have triggered this in John Cook's mind, because he apparently stuck up for Samuel Gorton where he hadn't done it for Roger Williams, and they expelled him from the church. And there's a line in the records of the Plymouth church that he couldn't be a deacon anymore. So that's when he moved to Dartmouth and lived on his father's, the family share of the purchase. So we know where he lived. He lived at the head of what is Howland Street, or we call it from here, Coggeshall Street, going up to the top of the hill there by the Oxford School. And there's a sign that says this is where he lived, and that was his homestead. We really don't know exactly, but whether they really found the foundations of that, but everyone seems quite convinced that that's where he lived. And so they have a sign up now in Fairhaven. Now during even though the church was upset with him, they must have had a great deal of respect for him, because he was the one that was made a magistrate. So that meant he did marriages, because in those days, of course, marriages weren't done in the church. So he did marriages, he did negotiations, and remember, he was given the task of looking after these newfangled people that were really far out, the Quakers. And so he was over here, he was supposed to report back to Plymouth on what these new people that were living in Dartmouth were doing. But during the King Philip's War, he had a little fort down almost across from Roland's Tire on Coggeshall Street. And if you're driving up Coggeshall Street and you look over, there's like 4 houses all together, but one of the ones has a wider area between it. They're almost all alike, but there's a wider area, and in there is that stone that says that this was where he had the garrison during King Philip's War and saved everybody that was living in Oxford, and none of them were hurt when the Indians came across, forded across the river right near Market Basket today. So then, by then he was adopting some of these ideas that we now attribute to Baptists. The separation of church and state and freedom of speech were what Baptists believe in. And he taught that, and he taught Bible study in Fairhaven, and every other week he went all the way across to the western part of Dartmouth and started this church, which is still there, a First Baptist Church, an American Baptist church in Tiverton. So that's the first church. Then he died, and there's a park to him. That's apparently an open park, and you can take your children or your dogs or your pets or have picnics or anything anytime you want in Oxford. It's just off where you start up Main Street going north by the high school and take a left at the nursing home. And so this is what they said about him. Now remember, he was in some ways he was very religious, and he started his Bible studies, and he started the church, and he was outspoken in his ideas, but he was such a wonderful man that this is what they put on his tombstone: a man of character and integrity, and the trustee for this part of the Commonwealth of the old colonial civil government of Plymouth. And we're not really sure if he is buried under that monument, but that is what the town says. And at least they have put up a nice monument in his memory. Now then we come to the churches 2 and 3, the Friends, or as we sometimes call them, the Quakers. Remember that they had the beliefs, there is that of God in every man, and that they should live up to the light that was in them, and they lived with the practical consequences of these beliefs. They had equality of sexes, ages, races, and economic status, and they had no need for clergy or sacred buildings or sacraments. And during worship, Quakers sat in silence and listened to God's voice, and anyone present could stand and speak a message at God's prompting, and the groups were called meetings rather than churches. Remember, we said that Henry Howland had purchased one of those lots in Dartmouth. Now each one of those 36 purchasers, or the 34 lots, were 2,333 acres. So they did not just give everybody the 2,000 acres. Well, they would have distributions every so often, so that you would get a distribution in the woodland in Acushnet near the river, or you would get a distribution near Sconnecut Neck, or a distribution in a harbor, so that everybody would have equally good land. And Henry Howland had not come over here to live, even though he had that privilege, because he had paid his money. His son, Zoeth, moved north to Pembroke. I'm not sure it was called Pembroke already, but that's really where it was, where Pembroke is now. And he and his uncle, Arthur, who was the brother of Henry Howland, and I think Arthur came over on the Mayflower, and then Henry came over on the James and Anne in 1623. And they had heard about this new idea of waiting for God to speak to them. And so they held a meeting in their house. And Abigail and Zoeth were, Abigail and Zoeth were about 19 or 20, a young married couple. So this is a report that they went to the house of Zoeth Howland and asked him why he would not go to the meeting, and he said he would not go to the meeting to hear lies, and that the devil could teach as good a sermon as the ministers. And they went back and they asked him again whether he would not go to meeting. And he said because the ministers taught lies and that the devil could teach a good a sermon. And he didn't deny that he had said that. So then they questioned him whether the ministers taught lies, and he said yes, and let him look in the scripture, and he should find it so. And for this he was arraigned at the term of court in March 1657 to 58 for speaking opprobriously of the ministers of God's word, and was sentenced to sit in the stocks. And he and his wife were also fined for not attending the ordained meetings, and it's not surprising that he departed from Plymouth and made his home in Dartmouth on a portion of his father's holdings where he could breathe a freer air. And so that's how the Howlands got to Dartmouth. So after being persecuted, they moved to Dartmouth, but it was before this meeting house was built. So this was built in 1706. So this was really built in the period that we're talking about, and that Pembroke meeting house has been restored and is still there, and is sometimes used for summer worship and for tours for school children. Now, down in Old Dartmouth, as you could tell and remember from the map, and as we all know, Dartmouth is really a peninsula. And so when you want to get from east to west, if you don't go across the very top of it, there really isn't any other road that really goes from east to west. And that's why they were protected down here. It was the generous inhabitants and the countryside protected on three sides of by water that provided a hospitable welcome to free-thinking colonists escaping from harsh treatment by Puritan leaders. These Puritan leaders in Boston that were out doing land grabs, this was so far away they didn't even try to come down here and get the land. So that also protected the colonists that were living here. And so they lived on some of Henry's land right at the head of Apponeganset and worshipped in Newport. So this is the meeting house at Newport, and once again it's not the original one. They didn't have cameras then, but they have added on wings to it. But if you go inside it, you still get the feeling of a very old building and what it must have been. And they actually held in 1651 the first yearly meeting, which was when they called all people that had become Quakers in all of New England down there for the first yearly meeting. And you know, we've had yearly meetings ever since. They have not missed. I think they stopped in World War II because, of course, they were holding them in Newport at the time, and I think there was a military reason why they may not have held them for 2 years during World War II. I'm not actually sure of that, but that's not in our subject for tonight. But this is where Zoeth and Abigail went to go to meeting, and everyone else that lived here that was starting to become interested in this new idea went down to Newport. They finally put out what's called a broadside in London of all the things that Massachusetts did to the Quakers in these first few years after Quakers had started. So in about 1660 or so, they put this up. 22 have been banished on pain of death. 3 have been martyred. So we know that was right after Mary Dyer was killed. 3 have had their right ears cut. 3 have been burned. 1 has been burned in the hand with the letter H. 31 persons have received 650 stripes. 1 was beat while his body was like jelly. Several were beat with pitched ropes. 5 appeals were made to England and were denied by the rulers of Boston. And 1,044 pounds worth of goods has been taken from them, being poor men, for meeting together in the fear of the Lord and for keeping the commands of Christ. And one is now lying in iron fetters, condemned to die. Now, some of these same things were happening to Baptists, too. It's important for us to know. I think that when I think about John Bunyan writing Pilgrim's Progress in the Bedford jail as a beginning of the Baptist denomination, he had Quakers in jail with him in Bedford jail at the same time as they had him in jail as a Baptist. And of course, he was writing Pilgrim's Progress in that same decade of the 1660s. Now, in 1656, Mary Dyer returned from England. This was a big turning point in the history of Quakers in New England. And it was just about the time that young Zoeth and Abigail were thinking about moving over here. So Mary Dyer had been a colonist who had been in Boston with her husband John and family, and had left Boston with Anne Hutchinson and her family and settled on Aquidneck Island with Roger Williams' group. And at that time, the Cornells were still in Boston. They had a little bar. They had a pub. And they stayed another year in Boston and did not leave and come down. They stayed working in Boston. But Anne Hutchinson and her family came down and settled on Aquidneck Island. And what happened was Anne and Mary realized that even though their husbands had stuck up for them leading Bible studies in Boston, when they were sticking up for them against somebody else's husband, as soon as they got down to Rhode Island, they were expected to not speak and they were to listen to their husbands. So this was a kind of a setback for Anne and Mary. So Mary went back to England, left her, and her family was here on the island. And when she got there, she met George Fox and became convinced of the truth of his ideas, and he said, "You should become a minister," because the Quakers believed that women should be leaders as well as men. So she returned to her family to find she had become a grandmother in her absence, and she became a very active preacher about these new Quaker ideas, and Rhode Island Indians asked her to preach to them. Well, that made the men mad because they had been trying to get the Indians to listen to them for some time, and she would row out in this boat to this little island and talk to the Indians every so often. Now, in 1660, she was hanged on Boston Common, and here's a woodcut of her on her way to her execution. Many of her descendants live in Dartmouth and southeastern Massachusetts today, and the story of her death and all of her witnesses is another long story. But needless to say, here was now a grandmother that had been put to death. They had two young men put to death, but now who were missionaries from England over here, but now there was a grandmother from right here in New England that had been put to death. And so the Quakers went back to work with a vengeance to convince the king in England to stop the Boston authorities from killing Quakers. By then, Charles II was on the throne, and so they were able, Charles II was a little more tolerant than the Cromwell had been. And so he wrote that the governor of Massachusetts should stop the hangings, but of course in the time it took to get to England with the petition and get back, one more person was killed. And that was the end of hanging the Quakers. And in 2011, for the anniversary, Russie Cornell and the other folks from Dartmouth Monthly Meeting, from Smith Neck, we went in and we stood and had a vigil at her statue in Boston and had a proclamation read. And the girl with the red pocketbook, her last name is still Dyer today. But you'll find there are many Dyers living in Dartmouth and even Mattapoisett. They might not be carrying the Dyer name, but they are direct descendants of her family. And she was the only woman statue on the State House for her witness for freedom of religion. Now, you could see she came over from England. I think she came into Boston and went down to Rhode Island. But there's another group of Quakers that came from England. They went south and came up into Massachusetts and up into Rhode Island. And so there was a great deal of activity, missionary activity among the Quakers at the time. And the second event was what's called the Voyage of the Woodhouse. And you may know this story. A man built a packet ship, and he went and told a few friends that he had built a packet ship to do little jaunts, merchant jaunts around the harbors of England, maybe the harbors of France. And they said, "You're just the man to take the missionaries to England, to America." And he said, "My boat's not for the ocean. It only does, local." And they said, "Oh no, you've got to go and take us to America. We prayed that God would send us someone with a boat, and you're the first one that showed up." So they got on the boat, and every morning, the way the story is, every morning the Quakers would get up on the deck to pray, and they just went straight. They followed the bowsprit, and they went, and they landed in western Long Island Sound, just enough over into Connecticut so that there was really nobody there to catch them, and they at least arrived, and all the missionaries got off safely. And what happened then is several of them came up to Newport and went east into the Massachusetts colony, and the way they did it, they went over to Martha's Vineyard because it was easy for them to go by boat. And when the Wampanoags there heard that the authorities wanted to arrest the missionaries, they took them in secret across the Woods Hole. I was at Aquina last weekend and saw one of their canoes, their ocean-going canoes, and at that time their canoes were 40 foot long. So they could easily go back and forth between the mainland and the island. And so they took the missionaries over to Woods Hole, and from there they went to Sandwich, where the Allen family welcomed them, and there's another name for Dartmouth. But this was down in Sandwich. Now, Nicholas Upsall was the first New England convert to Friends up in Boston. I think he was a jailer who had to jail one of the Quakers and was so impressed by their testimony that he became a Quaker. And he was then expelled from Boston for his heretical views, and he thought that he could go to Sandwich and find more people that would become Quakers. So the first official notice of a meeting of the Friends was on the 2nd month, 1657, Old Style, or April 13th, 1657, at the house of William Allen and his wife Priscilla at Spring Hill, East Sandwich. And this is the lawn next door to that house right now, the site of the first Quaker meeting in Massachusetts. And just down the road, on a dirt road, is the East Sandwich Meeting House today. So the two missionaries that had escaped because of the help of the Indians and made their way to Sandwich went to the Allens and held a meeting on August 30th. And so these two meetings are considered the first official meetings in Massachusetts of Quakers, because remember, the Quakers in Dartmouth were going to Newport to worship. And for this, Christopher Holder's ear was cut off, and so he's probably one of the ones listed in that broadside as ears of the people that ears were cut off. And there's much more about the story and how he went to Boston when he shouldn't have gone to Boston according to the authorities, and he went back to Newport, then he went to England, then he came back. But the upshot of it was that he finally settled in Newport, and he married Mary Scott. I don't know Mary Scott particularly, but their daughter Mary married Peleg Slocum. So she came over here. And Mary and Peleg were what's called public friends. That means they felt called to speak publicly and explain what Quakers believed. And they gave land for the Indian Meeting House, and they named their son Holder after Christopher Holder, Mary's father. That's important because in the deed, when Peleg gave some of his land to Holder, his son, it says you get the land that goes to that you start counting from the corner of the Indian Meeting House. And that's how we knew there was an Indian Meeting House, because this son Holder is mentioned in Peleg Slocum's will. Finally, in 1698, in the men's meeting in the town of Dartmouth, they decided to build a meeting house for the people of God that were in scorn called Quakers. And the Newport Monthly Meeting decided to set them off as an independent meeting to be here. So they built a house 35 foot long, 30 foot wide, and 14 feet. So we should look at the Apponeganset one that's there now. We know how much bigger it is than their original one. To worship and serve the true and living God in according as they were persuaded in conscience, they set out to do, and for no other use, intent, or purpose. And this was reported by Mr. Wing, who wrote such beautiful articles about the history of Dartmouth, and used to give them at the annual meetings of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. Meanwhile, Ralph Allen purchased land in Dartmouth. It was getting hot in Sandwich for people that were Quakers. So he purchased land sometime between 1663 and 1672, probably as an investment. And then sometime during that time, his sons moved over here. He died in Sandwich, but there are articles that say that he helped to build a grist mill in Dartmouth. So I need to know a little bit more about that. But that's Allen's Marsh today. So that's the, on the Slocum's land then, there was an Indian Quaker meeting house. And it was there before they built Apponeganset, because the Quakers, the white Quakers, were still walking to Newport to church. But the Indians had a meeting house. So the other 4, 5, and 6 are now congregational. Sarah Jenny, this is the Jenny's grist mill in Plymouth. She and her husband were some of the very devout pilgrims who went across and lived in France. And that's why they missed the Mayflower. Did not get to come to America on the Mayflower, but 3 years later they brought their family and came over on that big migration called the Anne and the James, when the two boats came together. And when John died, she inherited, they were asked to do the grist mill, so that they thought that in case the water in Plymouth was not good water, because English people did not know whether we had good fresh water, so they wanted a good place to make the beer so that they would have good healthy drinks. So that's why they got the job of having the grist mill. And this is a reproduction. The real grist mill is very close, and there's a house over there that you can go in to the bottom of the house and see pieces of the like where the grinding wheel was, the shaft and things like that. So this is where you've probably seen it running as you go down 58 and go into Plymouth that way. So when John Jenny died, and he was very respected in the colony because they were very good Christian people, Sarah inherited all his money. So that's how she had the money to buy the 2,333 acres, like the men. And why she signed Miss Jennings on the purchase and the agreement with Massasoit, we don't know. But Sarah then owned this section she would get her land. And when they had the distribution, she got a prize piece. She got from the top of Acushnet Hill all the way down to what you call the head of the river. So she had waterfront property. She also was up high, so she wouldn't have any problems with drainage or with pollution or anything. So she got this prize property in Dartmouth, and she came over and lived for a little while. So John Cook and Sarah Jenny are two of the original purchasers that actually came over here. And then her son ran into trouble running the mill with his mother and father both not there, and she had to go back home and take over the running of the mill. And so that's why she didn't live in Dartmouth for very long. And then her grandson came over and lived on the property. Now, you remember that according to the church, according to the government, both in Boston and in Plymouth, in order to have a town, you had to have a town minister and a church. And it was called a precinct church. And Dartmouth would not have a precinct church. but the General Court of Plymouth still let them become a town anyway. And they would send out, there are many stories about this, but I've heard that they would say to the townspeople, you have a responsibility to elect a suitable minister. Now by that, of course, they meant someone who had been to Harvard and was a Congregationalist. So they would send up a name of a Quaker, and they would go all the way through all the committees, and then they would say, not suitable. They would send his name back. Then they'd wait a while, and they would try again to get the Baptists and Quakers of Dartmouth to choose a Congregationalist to be their pastor. And then they wanted them to give money to support the pastor, because they did that in all other towns. But the Baptists and Quakers would not do that. They would pay all the rest of their taxes, but they would not pay the apportionment of the tax that was supposed to go to the minister. So Dartmouth had no official church. Now tradition holds that by 1696, if you were the Russells living on Elm Street and you wanted to go to church, you had Tiverton, but you might not be a Baptist. You had the Quakers, but you weren't a Quaker. So you would have to find how far you had to go to find a Congregationalist to worship with. So finally they did start worship services at the head of the river. When I first came down here, I sang in the choir with the Russells at the Congregational Church of South Dartmouth. I never realized that they were the same Russells that were the Russells that had been there on Elm Street for all of those years. So they really were solidly Congregationalists, I guess. They were still singing in the choir. But even though tradition holds that they had worship services up there, they don't have any record of ministers. They have no records of buildings or anything like that. So in 1707, the Massachusetts General Court said, we're going to fix those people of Dartmouth once and for all, because, and they sent down a new graduate straight out of Harvard, Samuel Hunt, to be the precinct church minister. Now, how did they get the people to accept this minister? They married him to the daughter of the biggest employer in that area of town. And the government just assumed that Dartmouth residents would then pay their apportionment and start supporting Samuel Hunt. That was not to be, I don't think. Let's see, we're going to stop at 1707, but now we have the Congregational Church has officially begun in our area. And so this is the hill where the meeting house was, and you can still see the area. If you walk on that hill, you can see they buried people around it. So between the tombstones, you can see where the meeting house was. And you can see that as you go up to the Acushnet Cemetery now, just past those beautiful big stone gates. So Sarah Jenney's grandson gave the land for the precinct meeting house and cemetery. So they gave that beautiful piece of land that the Jenneys owned because he said in his deed it was for the Presbyterians, because they sometimes call Congregationalist Presbyterians, who had the true religion. So he thought it was important that he give that land to the church. Let me see this. Meanwhile, we want to talk about what was going on with the original people that were living here, the Indians. They, in 1663, they finished translating the Bible into Algonquin. And this was very important because the first Bible ever printed in the colonies was in Algonquin. It wasn't an English Bible. And John Sassaman was from Lakeville. And he was a Harvard-trained Indian that went to school with all of the leaders, the English leaders who became leaders of the colony. So he had an excellent education. He knew Greek and Hebrew. He knew all the Greek philosophers, all the regular subjects that you would learn if you went to Harvard. And James the Printer went to Harvard some too. He was a Nipmuc Indian from Natick. So now the Indian pastors had this Bible to preach from. This is the first page of Matthew. And so John Sassaman had an Eliot Bible in the Lakeville Meeting House, the precinct meeting house on 105 in Lakeville. And I imagine that the pastor in Fairhaven had one too. Whoops. Now there was a man in Taunton, a young man, Samuel Danforth Jr. His father, Samuel Danforth Sr., had been the pastor of the First Church at Roxbury, and the pastor teacher, the assistant pastor at the Roxbury Church for 40 years, the assistant, was John Eliot. So this little boy was born while John Eliot was the assistant pastor and was making his bi-weekly trips out to Natick to help the Indians. So this was part of his life growing up. His father was Samuel Danforth Sr., he was Samuel Danforth Jr. John Eliot's son, John Eliot Jr., went and started the Eliot Church in Newton. Well, Samuel Danforth was sent down to Taunton, and he stayed at Taunton and was the pastor at Taunton for his whole life. And I think the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was like home missions, because it was to the Indians, commissioned him to go around Massachusetts and give a report on every Indian, Christian Indian that there was. And of course this was after the King Philip's War. There were many less Indians. And I think that should be 1698, but it might have taken him 2 years to do the report. So he reported on a church, Nakukumansit, and that's the one that was in Dartmouth, but it was actually on Sconnecut Neck. And in 1695, the Indian pastor was ordained there. His name was William Simon. Does anyone ever heard of Martha Simon? All right, so Martha Simon was a descendant of William Simon. And I don't have her picture here now, but William Simon was ordained a minister by Japhet. And he preached twice on the Sabbath, and there were 20 families of praying Indians, 120 in all. Now we think that the reason that Danforth did not report on the Indians at the Indian meeting house here was because they were Quakers, and he had been asked to report on the Christian Indians. So the meeting house here does not show up in the report. Instead, this one from Fairhaven shows up, and the one from Acushnet. And he went there once a month, and there were 14 families, and both of these churches also had school teachers to teach the children to read. I bring this up because remember at the beginning I told you there was a little Indian boy whose mother had said that she would try to make sure that he would amount to something if this Great Spirit saved her boy. That was Japhet. That was the Indian that came to Dartmouth to ordain William Simon to be the minister. So there's our 6 churches in 1707 and 8.
Sure, the panel will entertain questions. If there are no questions, I have a comment. The church in Tiverton that she talked about, that John Cook was involved with, has been very much written about in a book that you can read. You can get it in the library, in some libraries. And it's written by a guy named Pastor Pelly Burroughs, and it's his diary. And he wrote the diary around the time of the Revolution, and he was a preacher who, in those days, he went from house to house as well as preaching at church, and married people, buried people, and so forth. And he talks very much about Native Americans and black families and so on in the area around Tiverton. He also, to help his neighbors and apparently make money, built stone walls. So many of the stone walls in that area of Tiverton, Little Compton, were built by Pastor Pelham Burroughs. It's a very fascinating book, very fine print. It was transcribed from his original diaries by people from the Rhode Island Historical Society. And you can buy it on Amazon. It's probably a fairly expensive book, but you can also get it in the library if you're willing to wait for a while. It's pretty popular. Any other questions or comments?
Well, we should mention, Bob was mentioning just before we started, there's a book called History of the Churches of New Bedford from 1869, and that was put out by the Standard Times. They like on the religion page put a chapter a week, and then they revised it and put it out as a. I have the original articles plus the book itself, and so that's, and you can now find it on the web.
It's reprinted.
And it's reprinted.
It's been reprinted, so you can buy it as a reprinted edition.
Another note, one of the important people that Pam talked about was Zoph Howland. And he's also known not only for his originating many of the Henry Howland descendants in this area, but because of the fact that he was killed by the Indians over in Tiverton near the bridge. Where
Near the Stone Bridge, yep.
Used to be. And he was the father of Benjamin Howland that we know from this area, and many other Howlands. And those Howlands were also connected with the Cummings house. Another connection with Pam's history of churches, the business of paying taxes to support ministers. Remember, we talked here quite a long time ago now about Philip Cummings, who was slapped in jail. He was a constable of Dartmouth. He was put in jail because he did not turn in the money he was supposed to collect to pay the ministerial tax. And he died in jail and left a widow and 7 or 8 children. And the Philip Cummings house is still standing. He built it in 1702, just before he went to jail. And as a matter of fact, the latest news on the Cummings house, they're re-roofing the Cummings house. The family has bought it and they're putting a new roof on it. Any other comments anyone has?
I would just add that there are many descendant churches of that original church from 1708 up in the head of the bay. Because churches, like all churches even today, occasionally had disputes over theology, and so there are a number of groups that split off, and there's a whole family tree of churches that hark back to that church, original church at the head of the bay.
There's a beautiful old house right near that old church that was still standing not too long ago, called the Somerton House. You may have seen pictures of it. It was one of those gambrel-roofed houses, and it was of the vintage of the early 1700s.
I think they've rebuilt it so that it still has a gambrel roof, but it's
because the town took it down at one point, the Somerton House, and Irwin Marks, who many of us remember, erected a large sign on the location. The DPW had a garage there.
Interpretive sign. I was there for the dedication.
Then I'm going to have to
Then
I'm going to have to check that out. I'm going to check that out. But Judy mentioned that next year in September there's a big celebration for Paul Cuffey.
Right.
And of course, as a religious person, I'm always hoping that whenever we have Paul Cuffey mentioned, his faith will be remembered as well, and that some of the reason that he was able to accomplish so much as he did is because his mother had been a praying Indian on Cutty-Hunk when he was a boy. She named all her boys and girls Bible names. Like
did he put money into the Quaker meeting in Westport?
Oh yeah, he was the chairman of the building committee. As the richest man in church in the town, he had to be chairman of the building committee.
Isn't there a monument or something?
Yep, there's a monument there, and his graves are there.
It's great.
Don?
When did you ever find in your studies when they stopped calling it a meeting house for the churches and became a church? Whether those at that time period, they were still, whether it was Quaker or Congregationalist or Baptist, they were still meeting houses.
I don't know. I don't know. I know, but many people still call them meeting houses. It depends on your view of the church, on whether the church are the people or the church is the building or the church is the organization. So there are still people that would call
Any church.
a building a meeting house.
I've never come across that in my life.
No, we have to look it up.
I just, only the Quakers is the only time I've heard it.
No, no.
In a meeting.
But see, the Baptists call it, that's the First Baptist Meeting House is downtown right now in New Bedford.
And Providence.
And the big First Baptist one is still called the Meeting House?
So
Yeah, very, very important.
I don't know when our church shifted. May have had to do with the building of the buildings.
The one that you have now, yeah.
Some of the town hall, what we now call town hall, used to be called the townhouse in a lot of the old colonial literature. What later became a town hall was originally called the townhouse. So it might be something to do with the general use of the term.
As many of those meetings all took place at private residences in the early days. There was not a common meeting house. They went to somebody's house.
They
held a meeting at a house.
The business meetings as well as the religious meetings.
Some of the other religious persuasions, like in the Amish, there are church Amish and there are house Amish. If you ever studied the Amish in Pennsylvania, and the house Amish still meet in houses, and they carry the benches around from house to house and set up for the meeting that weekend at the house. And then there are church Amish who have little churches, little meeting houses, churches.
Sure saves maintenance on the building.
Anything else anyone would like to share?
Oh, yeah.
John,
When you speak about head of the river, which I thought you did at one or two
Right.
points, where is that? Westport?
no, that's where Acushnet, where the Acushnet River and Tarkin Hill Road goes across the Acushnet River there, and then the river really gets narrow above that bridge.
And over here is
Head of the bay.
harbor?
Is it head of the bay?
Yeah, usually.
In-
It's a
in-
Pontiganset.
In the early patterns of settlement, the head of the Acushnet River, the head of the Pascamanset River, the head of the Westport River, were all places where you could get across the river if you're traveling. And so villages were established there. They were usually good places where geographically you could capture the water power. And so mills were established in all of those places. And they became centers of travel, crossroads. And so that sometimes the head of the river is in Nokachoke River or the Westport River. Sometimes it's in Smith Mills. Sometimes it's in
Yeah.
Originally it was in Acushnet, because that's the earliest part of where things.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting that the book, to learn about the history of Dartmouth, one would read the history of the town of Acushnet, with the exception that it does not mention the Quakers down here. It doesn't mention Russell's Mills as much, but they built boats up in the Acushnet River. They had the Weldon cotton factory that's up in the woods there. You could still go out and see some of the walls there. The white factory on Hamlin Street. This was really where the business of Dartmouth was done.
It preceded what is now New Bedford.
Right.
That's the
Before it
center
came
of
down
commerce.
to, yeah.
When was Tiverton set off from Dartmouth?
It wasn't. It was a separate purchase. Tiverton was a separate purchase from Dartmouth. Tiverton and Little Compton were a separate purchase after the
And the boundaries changed, later on the boundaries changed a little
Yeah, a
bit.
little bit.
Some parts of it were originally.
I think some
bounded.
Only
Yeah.
very
Boundaries
little
were
bit.
changed.
Yeah, very little
Part of,
Just a strip.
Adamsville, just a very narrow
Right.
strip.
Yeah, Not very much.
Yeah.
But did you know that a good part of Fall River was Rhode Island? And they changed the name of Fall River back and forth and moved the southern border of Fall River up and down. I just found that, yeah.
Called Troy.
You know, it was called Troy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
Speaking about Indian names, the Quikashant River, it's a pretty good Indian name. Sir?
Pam, I can give you an anecdote on that that was quite interesting. In all my years of doing appraisal work, I got a call from Chris Borden. The Borden House used to be where the old Westport Auto Theater was, but up on the hill. Today it's a housing development and they tore the house down. But when he asked me to go up and appraise it, I go in there, and in the living room they had a full page of the Fall River Herald That house on that foundation was in 2 states and 3 towns and never moved. Because it was originally part of Dartmouth, then it became part of Rhode Island, Tiverton, and then it became Westport, and so it shuffled through two states and 3 towns on the same foundation. So the lines were moved, not the house.
That's a great story. There are
Good
houses
story.
in present day Acushnet that are exactly the same way. Because Acushnet was Fairhaven, it was New Bedford, and it was Dartmouth. All in the same house.
Sure, same house, never moved.
Yeah, Acushnet really wasn't firmed up until like in the 1800s. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's why I tried to limit it tonight to just 1707, because after that, when the churches moved down to New Bedford, that's another whole story, but the people of this part of Dartmouth aren't as interested in that story.
Pam, one of the questions that I thought would come up, but it didn't, is there's an older denomination in Old Dartmouth, was the Church of Smith Mills, which was originally Baptist, but later was what was called Christian Church. They don't mean Christian like all the other Christian churches, they mean special denomination. There's still a few of those around, and I think...
Oh, I thought that would be another talk.
Yeah, I've heard you say that. I personally would like to book you for that talk.
We'll be back next year for that.
The second Christian
That
church was the one on
situation-
Russell's Mills.
That situation arose because in the eyes of the public, because those congregations in South Dartmouth particularly practiced immersion, although they called themselves Christian, which at that point was an emerging sense of a denomination. But in the eyes of the public, I dropped into a person's house and saw him sitting outside just where Gulf Hill crosses, I'm sorry?
Bakerville?
No, I can't say the name of the road. I can't, Bakerville.
Yeah.
And just about down on Bakerville, there was a Baptist Christian church, but it was a Christian church. And on that gentleman sitting on the porch was saying, "Oh, you mean the Baptist church down there?" Okay, so the Baptist identification was attributed to that congregation because they couldn't, and if you look at the town maps, the designation of that of the buildings changed designation. And it's that strange identification because they baptized, they dunked people.
So
The Elder Hicks, if you study the biography of Elder Daniel Hicks, you'll find that he had a lot to do with the founding of that denomination.
Absolutely.
And he justified it by various ways.
But see,
We'll get into later.
see, I think Smith Mills was always a Christian church and never a Baptist church. But Anderson Way was called Baptist Street because the town thought it was a Baptist church.
Whatever. I have one last story.
I just wanted to add, I mean, I'm not sure, but I believe that the church across the road, which is now, was a Christian church.
Right.
Yes.
Oh,
There's
absolutely.
there's one in Plainville, right on Old Fall River Road, still practicing. I have one last story. There's a fellow named Macumba who lived in Dartmouth who made his living digging clams. This is supposed to be a true story, but I don't have any documentation. And he found the Lord at a Baptist meeting one time, and he got baptized in the Slocum River. And when they put him under and said, "In the name of the Lord and the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit," he came up with a clam in his hand.
Well, now I think the book that Bob was referring to has another good baptism story. And that is the story. They used to have many Sunday afternoons in the Acushnet River when it was still clear, that they would have 3 and 4 different baptisms going on in groups of baptizing at the same time. And the mother of one of the congregational deacons decided she was going to be baptized. Well, the deacon was so upset that his mother was changing over to being a Baptist that he rode his horse into the water and the horse's feet slipped on the little stones, and he fell off, and he fell right down in front of the minister. And when he came up, the minister said, "If I'd have known you wanted to be baptized, I would have told you an easier way."
Thank you all. You know, we've got some refreshments. We can keep talking and sharing stories. But I really sincerely am grateful for your attention and your attendance and for Pam's wonderful talk. And hope you'll come back and hear us again.
A great approach to the subject.